So we're really starting Pirkei Avot, right? This book called Pirkei Avot. Pirkei actually means chapters of the fathers. Pirkei Avot means chapters of the fathers, but it gets the name Ethics of the Fathers because that's what the content appears to be, or statements of ethics. And so we're kind of do a little bit of orientation. We could talk about translations and where you find them and all of that. And then we'll get through probably um, numbers 1 through 3 in the first chapter, I would guess. Um, and then as we progress each month, we'll do a little bit more, do a little bit more. And then my plan is actually as we go to compile here's the translation that we went with for this particular statement as a Google Doc so that you can kind of refer back and forth without having to go and acquire a copy of the book in whatever translation you might happen to encounter, and there are lots of them out there. Um, so we'll introduce what we're going to study. We'll talk about the structure of the work itself, um, because it is like the other materials with which it appears in rabbinic literature, but is also not like it. Um, Place it in time and get to start asking, why do we have this and what do we do with it? And we'll always be asking that, why do we have this and what can we do with it question as we go through each successive piece of Pirkei Avot, because the rabbis are up to something. There are a couple of different scholarly theories as to what they're up to. Um, None of these scholarly theories think that what they're up to is putting together a nice, quaint collection of moral statements to be removed from context and played with um, as people might desire, which is what we actually do with Pirkei Avot a lot of the time these days. So first, what is it? So if you remember the Passover Seder, there's a Chad Gadya, or who knows one, rather. Who knows one, I know one. Who knows two, I know two. And when you get to who knows six, the answer to who knows six is six are the orders of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is a collection of statements of legal opinion compiled around 200 CE. So you'll notice that I did not call it a book of law because it's not a book of law. Neither, for that matter, is the Talmud actually a book of law in the way that we think of a book of law that you go to and you use it as a reference work. Um, the Mishnah has six orders or like large divisions of the work that center on particular topics. So you'll see that I've listed um, several of the orders here. So Zeraim, seeds, covers agriculture, but also covers blessings. That's actually how the Mishnah opens is with a tractate called Brachot, which means blessings, and is about here's what you say in the morning, and here's what you say in the evening, and here's what you say when you eat this kind of food, and here's what you say when you see a rainbow, and here's what you say when you see a mountain. Um, it sort of falls, that's what that section covers because it's sort of basic in a way to everything that follows. So Zeraim covers agriculture, Nashim covers laws related to women and marriage and divorce and menstruation and all of these other kinds of topics. Avot lives in an order called Nizikin, which means damages. So Nizikin is the chunk of the Mishnah where civil and criminal law and procedure live, where how you run courts lives, where inheritance laws live. And so Avot is sort of one of the very last tractates that is in, as they're put together in traditional collections, Avot's one of the very last tractates in Nizikin. And that tells you something about what it's actually worried about, right? What is a vote worried about? A vote is worried about scholars of the law. That's why it's in the thing that's about law. And we should probably remember that biblical and Mishnaic Hebrew don't really have a word that means ethics. But that's not a concept necessarily for them. As though that weren't enough terminology, we refer to stuff in the Mishnah like we would refer to things in biblical books. So Deuteronomy 1:1 is the first chapter, the first verse of Deuteronomy. In the Mishnah, each verse is called a Mishnah. So Mishnah means repetition. And so there's the Mishnah, the book, and then within it, the individual statements are each called a Mishnah. Mishnayot is the plural. You'll hear me say it occasionally, but you'll also probably hear me say Mishnahs if I do refer to multiple of the individual pieces, just because I know that most people don't know what Mishnayot means, and you don't have to know Hebrew to do this. Um, the point of most of these individual statements in the Mishnah is not to give you the rule. The point of these individual statements is to give you several opinions on what the rule could be for a specific situation. So, the very beginning of the Mishnah introduces when you say the Shema in the evening, and it gives you three different opinions on that. And sometimes you get an example or a piece of evidence or authority to kind of back it up, but they're not there to give you the rule. One of the first things you learn when you start studying Talmud is what the Mishnah says is not the rule. You might not get the rule from the Talmud either in a really clear way. The general point of the structure is to preserve these individual points for later discussion in a way that's easy to memorize. When the rabbis studied and taught, they actually had a human in the room. Well, hold on. When the rabbis studied, they actually had a human in the room who was called a Mishnah, meaning a repeater. That person had memorized the entire Mishnah, which you can do because in Hebrew there's a fixed structure and it's not so hard. And basically, the rabbi teaching would turn to the Mishnah and would say, hey, repeat the section that starts blah, 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 blah. And the guy would just rattle it off. He was not a rabbi himself. These were not people who were legal scholars. They were there because they could memorize stuff, right? They had a specific talent, and that's what they were there for. They didn't really study along with everyone. So there's a formula, or at least a formulaic way that the Mishnah puts its stuff together so that it can be memorized and debated later. But it's almost always several pieces of opinion on an area. A vote doesn't behave like this. It sort of does at first glance, but it's a little different. So we're going to we've got a comparison here. These are two different Mishnayot, right? Mishnahs, individual Mishnahs. The one on the left is from Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is about how you run courts. Avot is Pirkei Avot. And somebody want to read aloud Sanhedrin 1, 2.
I'll read it. A
Okay.
corporal punishment case is decided by three judges. They said, in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, by 23 judges. Intercalation of the months by three. Intercalation of the years by three. According to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel says, Gamaliel, They start with three, debate with five, and conclude with seven. But if they conclude with only three judges deliberating, an intercalation is valid.
How many rules did we have?
Quite a few.
Yeah, right. So we've got here's how you do a corporal punishment case. You get three judges, but there's another guy who says actually it's 23. The idea being maybe you should have more rabbis before you start whipping people. Intercalation of the months. This is this is how you determine whether the month you're in is 29 or 30 days in the Hebrew calendar. Intercalation of the months is determined by three judges. Intercalation of the years, is this year a leap year, is determined by three judges. According to one guy, the other one says, well, actually, you can start discussing with three. The debate has to have five, and you need seven to vote. But I guess if you can't get enough people, three is fine. So we've got three different rules that we're trying to assign numbers of judges to, and we've got multiple opinions. And the Hebrew is formulaic enough to be memorized. Compared to Avot 1:2, which just says, Shimon the righteous was among the last of the men of the great assembly. He used to say, the world stands upon three things, upon the Torah, and upon sacrificial worship at the temple, and upon deeds of loving kindness. So if we look at these, what are the things that seem similar? And anybody can shout out or type in the chat or any of that. I mean, other than we've got some rabbis named, right? So we've got three rules essentially, right? Shimon the righteous used to say A, B, and C. In Sanhedrin, we had rule A, rule B, rule C, and then we've got the debates kind of baked in to let us know there are differences of opinion. We don't have, in Sanhedrin, we don't have anybody telling us the lineage of any of these scholars. We have the name of the scholar, we have their opinion, but nobody says Rabbi Meir, who was a student of. We just kind of have the name and we move on with our day. Whereas a vote is like Shimon the righteous was among the last of the men of the great assembly, and then you get to go, well, what is the great assembly? What does that mean? And when the rabbis write texts, they're parsimonious. At least the Mishnah is very parsimonious. They don't say a thing unless they think you need to know it. So they clearly think you need to know where this guy Shimon the righteous came from. It matters. Now, we don't know how it matters yet, but it matters. So a vote is not giving you statements of law, but it seems to be about the value of law and the lineage of the rabbi, not who agrees with what he says. It only mentions one rabbi. That's not always going to be true. There's also no debate. There's no one coming in and contradicting and saying, well, actually, the three things the Torah stands on are. There are other statements where other people give an opinion on what the three things the world stands on happen to be, and they differ. But it's not like, okay, we have Shimon the righteous who says X, and then you get to that next person and it's put in contrast. That person's just taken on their own and they say what they say and we move on, and no one draws attention to the discrepancy because that's not what a vote is up to. It's not trying to preserve debate so that We can have a debate in a classroom somewhere. It's doing its own thing. Another thing that's different is Sanhedrin is part of the Talmud. So the Mishnah gets commented on by a work called the Gemara, and that makes the Talmud. Some tractates of the Mishnah have that, others don't. Avot does not have that. There is a kind of a quasi-commentary work called Avot de Rabbi Natan. It's a bunch of sermons. It's contemplative essays about these things. It's not, let's figure out exactly what this word means, which is what the Talmud at least seems like it's trying to do. So we don't even really worry about the Talmud with this stuff. That's not what's going on. This is a whole other kind of document. There are commentaries to the Mishnah and things like that, but it's not a legal, a vote is not a legal text in the same way, and it doesn't get pieced apart in the same way. So before we kind of move from this stuff about what's going on, just like as a general lay of the land, a vote part of the Mishnah in the order that addresses criminal, civil law, and court procedure, inheritance and property and things like that. Superficially, seems like it fits. Fairly direct statements in Hebrew, relatively easy to memorize, seems to deal with a specific topic, divided into chapters and individual statements, and often in threes, which we saw with Sanhedrin. Like that's very common in the Mishnah. But when we look at it more closely, it's its own thing. We're not seeing disputed statements. They're not about legal issues. We're getting background on the rabbis themselves, which the Mishnah doesn't usually care about. And things seem to have ethical valence somehow, but might be about bigger issues, right? What are the three things that the world stands on? It's not actually an ethical statement necessarily. It's a statement of theology, which the Mishnah doesn't usually bother with. So a vote is different and is able to be used or misused because of how it's different. So we'll look at use and misuse as part of kind of exploring this work. So before we move on, questions. And an acceptable question is always, what did I get myself into here?
I'll ask a technical question.
Yeah.
Um, so you said our vote explains who the rabbis are, and like the Sanhedrin, Mishnah Sanhedrin does not. I had the is our vote covering a period of time so old that you don't know who they are, but everybody knows who Rabbi Meir is. You don't have to explain. Even I know who Rabbi Meir is, but I don't know who some of these other people are mentioned in the Avot because they predate.
Yeah.
They're actually mythical people. They're not actually real people. There's some of them. Anyway.
There's a real chance. Um, there's a real chance that they're mythical people or they're people that are very clouded in memory. They, you don't find people quoting a lot of these guys in legal texts. I mean, Shimon the Righteous appears once or twice. Um, but what we'll see is sometimes even a person that like, oh, we know Rabbi Meir because he's all over the Talmud. Occasionally, somebody that we know who they are, we're going to find out whose student they were. So Avot does it even for people that are, Rabbi Meir is, um, he's all over the place. Within the first chapter of the very first tractate in the Mishnah, they're quoting Rabbi Meir. Um, but they're still going to, in Avot, they're still going to tell you who he studied with. So they're charting some scholarly genealogy, even for people that we know who they are. So they care for perhaps different reasons.
One of the things I've heard about at least the Mishnah and maybe even the Talmud is that it assumes whatever that when you read part of it, it assumes you know the whole thing, right? And you because and therefore this kind of explanation seems superfluous. So I really wonder why our vote is so different.
Yeah, so there are a few different theories floating around in the academic world. They are primarily focused on either theology, on theories about the rabbis' theologies, or on political theories. So, for example, he's deceased for a while now, a scholar named Daniel Elazar, who wrote an article about the politics of Pirkei Avot. There's a more recent scholarly work that actually argues that what Pirkei Avot is trying to do is preserve a particular line of scholars' authority who don't tend to win debates in the Talmud. And so it's trying to bolster these guys for internal rabbinic debates. So there's a number of different theories about what's going on. Um, and each of those takes as important the fact that we're learning about scholars and their lineages. So there are a few different explanations for why it's different. Um, I'm not 100% sold on any one of these theories. Um, I particularly find the one that's saying, "Oh, they're trying to preserve the authority of these scholars who don't win arguments." I don't know about that one. That seems to be stretching it. But they are up to other things, which explains the difference in how this is treated. That they don't necessarily assume that you know everything in a vote, but you don't have to, because it's not going to bring up a lot of legal issues.
But presumably, when the Mishnah was compiled, the decision was made to include our vote in the Mishnah, even though I assume that that was a point of discretion, that it could have been, I don't know, maybe if
Yeah.
whether it was already so embedded in the minds of people, the memorization as part of the Mishnah, that it had to be included. I just don't know.
Yeah, there's not a lot of information about the canonization of the Mishnah. This problem that keeps coming up with when you look at the ancient world is there's really not very much Jewish literature from the ancient world, and you'd want to know a lot more than there is. Um, so there's just a lot of guesswork. Um, I haven't looked at this source yet, but there are several commentaries on the Mishnah that are available. Most of them are in Hebrew, so they're not accessible to most people. There is a relatively new 3-volume translation and scholarly commentary in English by several American scholars. Um, it's not at Howard County's library, and I'm just not willing to pay $300 for the books. Um, I mean, I would be willing to, but I also suspect I would get in some amount of trouble at home if I did that. So I haven't done it. And an important thing to know is when you do pick up a translation that may have a commentary in it, like this is the Koren Publishers translation. The translator of this is Orthodox, but relatively well respected as a scholar. He's not talking about the rabbi's politics, right? This is like personal edification kind of commentary. with a little bit of historical background. So most of the theories for this are kind of locked into scholarly literature that's really quite expensive, unfortunately. Other questions? Okay, so let's take a look at the start of Avot and get a sense for what might be happening and how this thing gets put together and how it's read. And, we've noted that Avot's unusual. You've mostly taken my word for it, which might or might not be a mistake. Um, but we'll just start at 1-1 and we'll move forward a few and compare and contrast and kind of see what we're starting to get into. So Avot 1-1 just says Moses received the Torah from Sinai and he passed it down to Joshua and Joshua to the elders and the elders to the prophets and the prophets passed it down to the men of the great assembly. Apparently I accidentally deleted that. They said three things: be patient in judgment, establish many students, and make a fence for this is often translated as around the Torah. Have you heard any of this one before?
Heard of the fence around the Torah?
Fence around the Torah, right? That's a really common one that comes up. And some people have heard the whole thing: be patient in judgment, establish many students, and make a fence around the Torah. Be patient in judgment is not people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. It's not about how you assess the moral worth of your neighbor. It uses the word din, that means law. So it's not about, oh, so and so's having a bad day. We should always remember that everybody's having their own experience as they go through life, and sometimes they have a bad day and it comes out. This is, don't be a hasty judge because the rabbis are judges. Establish many students. It's speaking to rabbis again, saying, you've been given the law. Your job is to propagate it. And your job is to protect it. Make a fence around the Torah. It gets translated as around. That's not the preposition that's actually used in Hebrew. The one that's used in Hebrew is for. But it's the same basic idea, right? Your job is to protect the integrity of this thing. What Torah are they talking about?
The Torah.
The Torah, right? So, but what does that mean?
The teachings, I guess, is that where you're going? The teachings?
So Moses
Oh,
received the Torah and he passed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets passed it to the men of the great assembly, and they said, make a fence around the Torah. Isn't the Torah written down? Why is Moses passing anything to anybody? How does Joshua pass it? Right, you just copy the thing.
no, no. Moses spoke the Torah.
Well,
He narrated it at the end of the story.
right, well, somebody writes it down, but then, you just copy scroll to scroll. And yeah, copying with fidelity is important and all of that, but for the rabbis, there are two Torahs. They are one Torah, but they're two. So there's the written Torah, right? The thing in the scroll. and then by extension, the whole rest of the Jewish Bible. And then there's the oral Torah, which is what the rabbi's business actually is. It's not, oh, we're in the business of teaching this written thing. They think you've already done that by the time you get to their building. What they're in the business of is passing down this interpretive tradition that tells you what the writing actually means. So they're very quick to say, oh, you can't read the Torah and like read the text and know what the law is because that scroll doesn't give you enough information. We have the rest of the information. And they actually argue the Torah tells you that there's not enough because when Moses was up on Sinai, the Torah says he was there for 40 days and 40 nights. And why does it add in the detail about 40 days and 40 nights? It's because during the day, when he had to be able to see, he was writing the Torah. And at night, he was talking to God and getting the oral Torah that gave him the interpretive tradition that actually tells you what the rules are. You absolutely can take this to places that seem utterly absurd, and the utter absurdities are part of ultra Orthodox Judaism today. Because it means that Moses knew about cars and elevators and light bulbs and computers because he knew everything. I mean, that's the idea here. So the Torah that we're talking about with Moses received Torah from Sinai, they're actually talking about the oral Torah that interprets the whole rest of it for you. And that's a pretty big claim. There's this whole other Torah. And the Mishnah is a documentation of debates of oral Torah, and the Talmud is a documentation of debates of oral Torah, and all of the Midrash are still more documentation of debates. And all of the legal codes that come up in the Middle Ages and all of the opinions of rabbis, they're all documentation of this stuff. Um, if you've had the misfortune of going to law school, or even if you haven't, you may have encountered a concept called legal positivism. Legal positivism is the idea that um, law is created by people and responds to human judgment and things like that. And it's often compared to natural law. And part of the idea behind natural law is that what judges did, this was the idea that existed before the 1900s, that what judges did was not make law, but they actually kind of essentially plucked the law out of the air. It already existed, and they were just kind of writing down the law. And that's not far off from what the rabbis thought that they were doing and what Orthodox Jews think the process of Jewish law is today. That what's going on is recovery of stuff that Moses forgot or that Moses knew and he tried to hand down and people forgot because memories are fallible and there are traumas in history and whatever else. So all of that is sort of hanging in the background on Avot 1:1. That this is not a nice little charting of history and a nice little phrase, that this is setting the stage for like how the rabbis think all of this works. And it's done very elliptically here, but that's kind of what's going on. And there are translations of this that actually do put oral in front of the word Torah to make it clear. I think it's even in this Koran one. Uh, no, he says Moses received the Torah at Sinai, but then very quickly talks about tradition and transmission came to depend on human beings who had no access to God through prophecy. So that's this guy. And when you open a commentary, the traditional commentaries, they immediately go, this means the oral Torah. This is how Orthodox Judaism conceives of itself. So all that's in 1:1. So before we move to 1:2, questions about any of this? And as always, what did I get myself into is an acceptable question.
If the Torah is oral, what does the fence represent?
What does the fence represent if the Torah is oral?
Just keeping it among Jewish people?
So it's usually understood, and this is how it's understood today, particularly in Orthodox Judaism, um, as a instruction to be strict. So building a fence around the Torah takes a number of different shapes. One example is very beginning of the Mishnah, we have this discussion of when you recite the Shema in the evening. And you get one group of rabbis who says, you have until dawn. You start at sundown and you have all the way until the sun comes up to get that commandment done. And somebody else comes along and says, well, no, actually, it's to the end of the first watch. So you divide in the rabbinic calendar, the night is divided into 2 watches. So they're roughly midnight is what they're talking about, but not quite. And then there's another one that says, no, no, it's definitely halfway through the night. And then they kind of admit at the end of all of this, the rule is actually sun up the next day, but the sages said midnight in order to keep people far from transgression. In other words, they made a fence around the Torah. Here's how we keep you from violating the Torah. You want to make decisions that curb the opportunities for people to screw up. And that's what building a fence around the Torah is a lot of the time, is saying, yeah, we know what the commandment, we know the outer bounds of the commandment, but actually we're going to tell you to do something different to avoid the problem that comes when you screw up. So that's an example of building a fence around the Torah. And then as Judaism progresses onward, you start to see the impulse becomes, for a lot of rabbis, to be strict in order to avoid problems. And the oral tradition continues to get more and more and more and more and more and more and more restrictive on things like using electricity on Shabbat. Because there's not actually any agreement among rabbis who worry about these kinds of legal issues. There's not actually agreement on what electricity is. Because they didn't know electricity 2,000 years ago as a thing that you could harness. They just knew that there was lightning. So, what's electricity? So in the early 1900s, there were actually rabbis who said you absolutely can turn on a light on Shabbat by hand. It's not fire. It's not work. It's not construction. It's not any of these things. It's fine. And then the other argument won out because you build a fence around the Torah. And that's how you end up with people with timers on their lights on Shabbat. Which, incidentally, the timers are probably also a violation of how Orthodox rabbis understand Jewish law. So there's that too. But that's building a fence around the Torah. Is how strict can we get? And so the impulse becomes strict, 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 strict. So there's no rule anywhere in the Talmud that says women can't wear tefillin. But if you ask an Orthodox rabbi, they're almost certainly going to tell you women can't wear tefillin because there's strictness, and there's strictness associated with misogyny that's baked into the Torah as well. So it really has become an impulse toward being more and more strict, which has been helped sociologically by the largest number of rabbis who survived the Holocaust were Hungarian rabbis, and the Hungarian tradition has always been very strict anyway. So that has made Orthodox Judaism more and more and more stringent, just as its own separate thing. Okay, so this is Avot 1:2, and it says, Shimon the righteous was among the last of the men of the great assembly, and he used to say, the world stands upon three things: upon the Torah, upon sacrificial worship at the temple, and upon deeds of loving kindness. There's a little wiggle room in the translation here, and it's important wiggle room. Deeds of loving kindness is the conventional way of translating this passage. And you will find that there are school choirs that sing this, like public school choirs, or sing some variation of this. There are other ones around, and they say loving kindness, but they don't talk about Torah and sacrificial worship. The deeds of loving kindness, the Hebrew phrase is gemilut chasadim, which if you've encountered that phrase, you've encountered that phrase as deeds of loving kindness. When people are in the hospital, you go and visit them. When people are short on money, you give to charity, right? There are all of these things that fall into that category of things that you do. But the word loving kindness here is translating chasadim, which is related to the word chasid, which doesn't mean loving kindness, it means righteous, as in deeds of religious fidelity. So Shimon the righteous is not saying the world stands upon the Torah, upon worshiping at the temple, and upon being nice to your neighbor. He's saying the world stands upon the Torah, sacrificial worship, and upon you being a religiously observant person. That's a very different statement than the one that we're accustomed to seeing and sometimes using. And it matters that this guy, Shimon the Righteous, doesn't really appear very many places in rabbinic literature, honestly. It matters that he's connected with the men of the Great Assembly because they are the last people that got the tradition from the prophets after the end of the Babylonian exile. And he's saying the world exists, continues to exist, because the Torah tells us what to do, because we continue to worship at the temple, and because we are good Jews and follow the rules. Not we take care of each other, which is what we usually mean by gemilut chasadim. That's not what he means. He means you're a good religious person, and that's what sustains the world. So you keep Shabbat, and you attend you attend the pilgrimage festivals at the temple, and you atone all year round, not just for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and you patiently await the Messiah, and you teach Torah, and that's Gemilut Chasadim, the way he means it. So what does this tell you about Avot, about this book? What's its job?
I always thought, or I thought we've been taught that it kind of tells us what's important. And I'm just laughing hysterically because we say these words a lot and we don't mean what it was originally intentioned for it to mean.
Nope, we
And
don't.
so how did that happen?
How did that happen? Well, um, how did that happen? That happened because because at a certain point, and it's not far off from when a vote is actually put together, people treat texts as a grab bag of things, and they do with them what they will. That's how people read texts. I mean, the worldview, this attempt to preserve a particular view of authority and institution, whatever else that's going on in a vote, is already, by the time it's written down, it's kind of somewhat irrelevant already. Because most of the generations of scholars that are mentioned in this thing are dead. And it's now moral guidance to judges, essentially. And then what ends up happening, particularly for kind of the everyday Jew in the medieval period and beyond, is this is also a place where you can always access a translation of Avot, by the way. If you have a conservative or Orthodox Siddur, if you go to the Shabbat Mincha, the Shabbat afternoon service, you often will find Pirkei Avot in that section of the book with translation, because this thing started to be studied during the summers in synagogues on Shabbat afternoons. It's in Hebrew, it's not in Aramaic. The educational system for the religious education system for Jews and in the diaspora for much of the medieval period was really, you learn biblical Hebrew starting at around age 5. You study some Torah, you might study some Mishnah, and then you probably were going to go to work and you weren't going to end up going to a yeshiva and studying Talmud. So you had pretty low level Hebrew if you really had Hebrew, but you could mostly understand Avot. And then, there would be a rabbi or somebody who was learned enough to be able to translate the rest of it for you. But you're not studying Talmud. The average Jew wasn't studying Talmud, but they might study this. And then they could take that and run with it. In our own time, most of us don't study Talmud, and it says nice, pithy things. And we take texts out of context, and that's how we end up treating this statement as a thing that deeds of loving kindness. It's great. It kind of means that, but it doesn't, that's not what they're talking about. There's these very hard-nosed points and then deeds of loving kindness. And it's like, I don't think that's what that means. To the point that when we talk about the Maccabees at Hanukkah, the books that talk about the Maccabees, the books of the Maccabees and Josephus and all these other things, don't actually call the Maccabees Maccabees very much. They call them Hasidians, which is the Greek transcription over of Hasidim. They don't call them the Maccabees. They call them pietists, fundamentalists. So Gemilut Hasidim does not really mean be nice to your neighbor. Except we started translating it that way because it kind of does. And it sounds good and it's appealing. And sometimes that's all it takes.
And it works in today's world.
And it works in today's world. Right. And this is our third one. Antigonus, the man of Soho. So this is translate. You'll see this guy called Antigonus, the man of Soho, or Antigonus, a man of Soho. It's just a location. Received the tradition from Shimon the righteous, and he used to say, "Do not be like workers who serve the master in expectation of receiving a reward. Rather be like workers who serve the master without expecting to receive an award, and let the fear of heaven be upon you." What's going on with his name?
Sounds like a Greek name, a Hellenistic name.
He is named Antigonus. He has a Greek name. The Antigone, right? The Antigone is a work about a guy named Antigonus. He's got a Greek name. So we already know, okay, this is after 323 BCE when Alexander the Great traipsed into the Levant. So it's after that. So this is already some kind of a Greco-Roman influenced person, or at least their parent was. And he used to say, don't be like workers who serve the master expecting to receive an award. Rather be like ones who serve without expecting to receive an award, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. Who's the master?
Isn't the master God?
Yeah. I mean, and you can take this, if we take this thing out of context and we don't mention the let fear of heaven be upon you, it seems like it's self-sacrificing to serve other people. So, but we can know for sure that we're talking about people serving God, even though God does not mention it all expressly here, other than maybe the fear of heaven. Because the Hebrew uses the word avadim, which I've translated as workers, but avadim means servants. And in our prior one, upon the Torah, upon sacrificial worship at the temple. So this is al haTorah, al ha'avodah. Avodah is the sacrificial service at the temple. Who does that? Avadim, workers or servants. So there are other ways of saying laborer. This doesn't say laborer in Hebrew. This says servant.
Or slave.
It can mean slaves. It does get used. It does get used for that, right? So there's a song that's often sung at Passover, "Avadim Hayinu," we were slaves. Um, Ancient Hebrew actually has a very small vocabulary as languages go, and so yeah, you sort of know. All right, we could be talking about slave. We have to. You always have to kind of know from context in a lot of cases because there just aren't a lot of words for some things in ancient Hebrew. There are a bizarre number of words for joy, a large enough number that you really can't actually effectively translate into English because English doesn't actually have that many words that work. Um, but then you don't really have a lot of words for servant or worker.
But in this context, since we've got somebody who's in some way, I don't know, Greco or Greco-Roman, Greco influenced, are we also looking at that potentially at that social situation in Greece?
Um, Potentially, although at
No.
this stage, most people haven't actually made it. There aren't a lot of Jews that have made it to Greece yet. Um, this is more likely somebody who had a parent who was Greek influenced and might have been somewhat upper class and gave him a Greek name to kind of grease the wheels of society a bit. And it's very likely that this person disappointed his parents, because the rabbis, by and large, are not a popular crowd before 70 CE. And this is well before 70 CE. This is before the switch from BCE to CE, even. And is another guy that we don't really know very much about. And it's translated Antigonus, the man of Soho. The Hebrew is literally a man of Soho. It just means that's where he's from. We could have as easily said Antigonus from Soho, and it'd have been fine. So if we take these three and put them next to each other, one of the things that you're seeing is we're spending a lot of time talking about who got lessons from whom, and they're making statements that you can break into three units easily. Be patient in judgment, establish many students, make a fence for the Torah. World stands upon three things: Torah, worship, deeds of Hasidism. He used to say, don't be like workers who serve the master, expecting a reward. Rather, be like ones who don't expect a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. The 1, 2, 3 format is easy to memorize, which is why we keep seeing things in threes. And we keep getting the so and so got it from so and so got it from so and so. Because it's important to establish the authority of these folks. The statements are axiomatic, so there aren't arguments, there aren't proof texts. It's not like somebody says the Torah said XYZ and that's how we know, which sometimes happens elsewhere in the Mishnah. It happens a little in Avot, but doesn't happen a lot. There's no disputes. No one is coming in and saying, well, but Rabbi so-and-so actually said blah, blah, blah. The way we saw with Sanhedrin 1-2, where we got, oh, you have 3 judges for a corporal punishment case, and then somebody chimes in and says, no, actually, it's 23. We don't have that. So the question is why? Why is it like this? We've spent all of this time in our lives hearing Avot used as it's the ethics of the fathers. We follow these are good moral pieces of moral advice. That doesn't seem to actually be what we're getting.
Hmm.
And it's basically because Avot's really a meta text. It wasn't written for us. It was written for Torah scholars to tell them what to do. These are the characteristics of being a good scholar, of being a good rabbi, of being a good judge. We translate them in weird ways and we get to other outcomes, or we take excerpts and they seem to be work for us because they're in isolation. But a vote's about who's how to value who's teaching and how to be good at that. What do we expect of you? There isn't a code of rabbinic conduct the way there is a code of judicial conduct for judges. This kind of does that. It's doing other things as well. And so we'll see as we go through it that originally it's really about Torah scholars and their students and teaching you how to have the character necessary, which is why Gemilut Chasadim doesn't mean be nice to your neighbor in its original context. It means be pious. Rabbis have to be pious. These rabbis have to be pious. I want to clarify. So that's where we want to kind of stop for today. Not just because there isn't another slide, but because A, we're at 2 minutes past the hour, and B, that's actually sort of the first takeaway that we need to have as we move through the rest of the text, because we're going to look at it as a how do we use this ourselves, but also a what does this thing mean originally? So we're doing kind of historical work and we're doing some amount of evaluating this for our own moral work. So that's our last slide. I'm happy to answer questions. Um, but I also know that there's the PBS series and, as Larry told us, the Westminster Kennel Club show. Um, and I'm sure there are other things happening. I'm woefully out of touch with TV. I'm discovering series I missed 15 years ago and just not up to speed on that. But happy to answer questions if folks have questions.
So what you're saying is that one of the unique things about our vote is that it makes statements without reference to prior to the Torah or to previous. It's not that Rabbi so-and-so said this, and therefore you should treat people well. It's just making statements.
Yeah, they're just it's this axiomatic thing. These are the three things that the world stands upon. Where'd you get that from? I got it from me. Probably he got it from somebody too, but it's reported as his thing, and it's important that we know he's connected to Moses, right? So this is like Moses granting his authority over all of this stuff.
But it's amazing how we've changed the meanings to suit ourselves today.
Translation is like that. And the way humans read text is like that. I mean, that's always true. People pull stuff out of, um, if you go and you read stuff from Isaiah that Christians cite as evidence of prefiguring of Jesus, um, stripes on his back and whatever, but then you read that verse in context and it's actually characterizing the Israelites in exile. But since the language works, Christians grabbed it and repurposed it. And that's how people read text a lot of the time. We even see it with Shakespeare. Um, First thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. The point of that statement is not, lawyers are horrible, kill them. The point is, if you want to tear down a society, you get rid of the rule of law. And you do that by getting rid of lawyers.
Okay.
So
I'm not good at this.
you can pull these quotes come out of context and can do all kinds of things. So there's value in kind of ratcheting back and looking at these texts and going, what did they think they were saying?
Right.
How do I feel about using that now?
Mhm. Great.
So that's our session for tonight. We'll be doing these the first Tuesday of the month, each month until we are through the whole thing. We'll pick up pace after a while. I've already got a lot of what's going on next month written up and in a PowerPoint, and it's going to kind of introduce us to broader interpretive tradition, which will be useful for us as well as we kind of proceed through, and then we'll be able to kind of pick up steam and do more each session and have more to compare with.